The courtroom doors burst open, and she stepped out in handcuffs. Not because she was guilty, but because the man she trusted most needed her to disappear. Across the street, he stood calm and untouched, with the woman he ruined her for. In less than 48 hours, she'd lost her career, her reputation, and her entire life, all because he framed her to protect his mistress. But here's what he didn't know. She didn't break. She stayed silent and spent an entire year planning something he would never see coming. Before we continue, can I ask you a question? Where in the world are you watching from right now? Comment below. We genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel. And don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button to get in fully. Because if stories about quiet strength, betrayal, and earned revenge pull you in, you're going to want to stay for what comes next. The handcuffs clicked shut as the courthouse doors swung open, and the sound cut through the morning air like a gunshot. Cameras surged forward, voices overlapped. Someone shouted her name, mispronouncing it badly, loudly, as if volume could replace accuracy. The woman at the center of it all, Aria Cole, didn't flinch. She had already learned that reacting only gave people what they wanted. Ms. Cole, did you steal the funds yourself? Were you working alone? Did you know your partner was married? Aria kept her eyes forward as officers guided her down the steps. The city looked different from this angle. Harder, less forgiving. A week ago, she'd walked these same streets, in tailored coats and quiet confidence. Now, strangers leaned in to catch a glimpse of her face, searching for guilt like it was something they could recognize. At the bottom of the steps, she finally looked up. Across the street, just beyond the press, stood Julian Markham, perfectly dressed, perfectly calm. His hands rested in his coat pockets, as if he were waiting for a ride, not watching the woman he'd just destroyed walk out of a courthouse in cuffs. Beside him stood Elena Pierce, her hair immaculate, her posture fragile, in a way that felt rehearsed. Elena's hand rested lightly on Julian's arm, a picture of concern for a man who had lost so much. Their eyes met. Julian didn't smile. He didn't wave. He didn't look away either. That was when Aria understood something she hadn't allowed herself to believe until that moment. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a mistake. This was intentional. The officers guided her toward the car. Metal door, dark interior. The world narrowed to a single thought as she ducked her head and stepped inside. He planned this. The car pulled away before she could look back again. 2 hours later, Aria sat alone in a processing room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper. The walls were bare except for a clock that ticked louder than it needed to. Every few minutes, someone walked past the door, glanced in, then moved on. She replayed the last 72 hours in her mind, not emotionally, but clinically, like a puzzle she needed to solve. The missing funds, the transaction trail that appeared overnight, the emails she'd never sent, the access logs she'd supposedly used. Every single piece of evidence pointed to her. Every single piece had required Julian's clearance to fabricate. When the officer finally returned, his tone was neutral, practiced. "You've been released pending further review. Your attorney will be in touch." Aria nodded and stood. No questions, no protests. Outside, the air felt heavier. She walked 3 blocks before she realized her phone was gone. Not lost, confiscated, along with her laptop, her work badge, her credit cards, her life neatly boxed and sealed. She didn't cry. She found a bench instead and sat down, watching traffic move like nothing in the world had changed. Her lawyer called that evening from a number she didn't recognize. "They've frozen your accounts," he said without preamble. "All of them." "I know," Araya replied. There was a pause. "Julian's team is cooperating fully. He's disappointed." Araya almost laughed. "Is that what he said?" "He's positioning this as a betrayal," the lawyer continued carefully. "A trusted partner, abusing access." "And Elena?" Another pause. "She's filed a statement." Of course she had. When the call ended, Arya stared at the dark screen of a borrowed phone and felt something settle into place inside her. Not anger, not despair, but clarity. She went back to her apartment to find the locks changed. The doorman avoided her eyes. "Management's orders," he said quietly. "I'm sorry." She thanked him anyway. That night, Arya slept on a couch that didn't belong to her, staring at a ceiling she'd never seen before. Every instinct told her to fight, to call someone, to demand answers, to clear her name immediately. She ignored every one of those instincts. Julian expected chaos. He expected tears. He expected her to make noise. So Arya did the opposite. She disappeared. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would alarm anyone. She canceled subscriptions. Let messages go unanswered. Took a temporary job under a different name in a different part of the city. One that paid in cash and asked no questions. From the outside, it looked like defeat. From the inside, it felt like preparation. She learned quickly how invisible a person could become when people assumed they were finished. Conversations happened around her as if she wasn't there. Names were dropped. Complaints were voiced freely. Julian's name came up often. "He's scrambling," someone said one afternoon, "trying to keep the board calm." "Elena's been everywhere," another replied. "Fundraisers, events, like she's auditioning." Arya listened, filed it all away. At night, she wrote everything down. Times, places, habits. Julian's patterns emerged like clockwork. The shortcuts he took, the corners he cut, the people he trusted without question. He was careful, but he was arrogant, and arrogance always left fingerprints. 3 weeks in, Arya received her first message from an unknown number. "You should have stayed quiet." She stared at the words for a long moment before deleting them. He thought she was still reacting. He had no idea she'd already stopped. By the end of the first month, Arya had mapped Julian's world more clearly than she ever had while standing beside him. And with that understanding came something else, something sharper than hope, opportunity. She closed her notebook, slid it into her bag, and allowed herself a small, private smile. Julian Markham had taken a year from her life. She intended to take everything else. Arya learned quickly that being invisible didn't mean being powerless. It meant people stopped watching what they said. Her temporary job was unremarkable by design. Front desk work at a private office suite owned by a holding company that rotated tenants every few months. Consultants, finance managers, legal advisors. The kind of place where people spoke in half sentences and assumed no one around them mattered. Arya mattered. She listened as men in expensive coats complained about deals stalling, audits taking longer than expected, and investors asking uncomfortable questions. Julian's name came up more often than she expected, usually paired with irritation. "He's cutting corners," one man said while signing a form. "Too many at once." Another scoffed, "He always does. Just never thought it would catch up to him." Arya kept her eyes on the screen, fingers moving calmly across the keyboard, memorizing every word. At night, she returned to the small studio she'd rented under a shortened version of her name. No decor, no distractions, just a table, a chair, and a notebook she never left unattended. She didn't write about how it felt to be locked out of her old life. She wrote timelines, Julian's board meetings, Elena's public appearances, the shell companies Julian favored for temporary transfers, the partners who benefited quietly and pretended not to notice. The more Arya mapped it out, the clearer the pattern became. Julian didn't frame her out of panic. He framed her out of convenience. She had been the easiest solution to a problem he didn't want attached to his name. That realization hurt more than the betrayal itself, but it also hardened something in her. By the second month, Julian's name began appearing in places Arya didn't expect. An overheard phone call mentioned a delayed acquisition. Another referenced a lender suddenly reconsidering exposure. None of it was dramatic, but none of it was accidental either. She didn't act yet. Acting too early would tip him off. Instead, she watched Elena. Elena Pierce was everywhere now. Charity dinners, panel, discussions, lifestyle interviews, always framed as Julian's steady support, always described as graceful under pressure. Arya noticed something else. Elena spoke carefully, too carefully, as if she were always listening for an echo that might come back to haunt her. That told Arya everything she needed to know. Elena was afraid. The first move came quietly. Arya sent an anonymous email to a junior compliance officer at one of Julian's partner firms. Not an accusation, just a question. It referenced a transaction date, a transfer amount, and a discrepancy that could be nothing. But it wasn't nothing. 2 weeks later, the firm initiated a routine internal review. Julian noticed. He didn't panic, not yet. But he adjusted, changed call schedules, shortened meetings, tightened access. Arya smiled when she heard about it. Revenge wasn't about destruction. It was about control. By month 4, Julian was losing patience. He snapped at assistants, missed calls, began showing up late to events Elena had carefully orchestrated to maintain appearances. Arya watched all of it from the sidelines, never once stepping into view. She documented every shift, every deviation, every overcorrection. One evening, her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. "You think you're smarter than me," Julian's voice said when she answered. Arya didn't respond. Silence stretched between them. "You could have handled this differently," he continued. "You made things complicated." Still nothing. Julian exhaled sharply. "You don't have proof." Arya finally spoke. "No, but you do." The line went dead. That was when she knew. He was rattled. The next phase moved faster. A second anonymous tip, this time to a journalist known for financial exposés. Again, no accusations, just documents, timelines, questions that begged to be asked. The article that followed was cautious, carefully worded. But it did something far more dangerous than an outright accusation. It introduced doubt. Julian responded publicly, with confidence. Privately, he began bleeding allies. One board member resigned quietly. Another postponed a vote that Julian needed to pass urgently. Elena's public appearances slowed. Arya could feel the momentum building, and so could the audience listening to her story now. If you're following this closely, take a moment to subscribe. Stories like this only work when they're told all the way through. By month 8, Julian was making mistakes. He confronted the wrong person, pressured the wrong partner, signed off on a document without verifying the source. Araya caught it immediately. This time, she didn't wait. She released the evidence, not to the public, but to the one entity Julian couldn't charm or threaten into silence: an independent regulatory board. The response was swift, not dramatic, just thorough. Julian's world slowed to a crawl. Every transaction paused. Every decision required review. Every meeting ended with more questions than answers. Elena left. Not publicly, not dramatically. She simply stopped appearing. When Julian finally reached Arya again, his voice was different, lower, careful. "What do you want?" he asked. Arya considered the question. "I want you to understand something," she said calmly. "This isn't revenge." "Then what is it?" "Correction." She hung up before he could respond. By the end of the year, Arya stood in a quiet cafe across the street from the same courthouse she'd walked out of in cuffs 12 months earlier. Her name was cleared that morning. No press conference, no apology from Julian. Just a formal notice correcting the record. It was enough. Julian Markham faded from headlines within weeks. Arya didn't. She rebuilt quietly, strategically, on her own terms. And as you reach this point in her story, ask yourself, would you have waited a year? But some stories don't end when the truth comes out. They end when control changes hands. Julian Markham noticed the shift before anyone said it out loud. It started with silence. Calls that used to be returned within minutes went unanswered for hours. Meetings that once ran long ended abruptly, with vague promises to circle back. People still smiled, still shook his hand, but their eyes no longer lingered. They were already looking past him, calculating distance. Julian hated that more than open confrontation. He paced his office late one evening, jacket off, tie loosened, the city glowing behind him like a reminder of everything he still owned. He told himself this was temporary. Market noise, regulatory paranoia. Nothing he hadn't handled before. But something felt different. Across the city, Arya felt it too. She had moved again. Nothing dramatic, just another quiet shift. A consulting role this time, short-term, project-based, buried deep inside a company that serviced multiple firms Julian depended on. She didn't seek access to him directly. She didn't need to. She watched the ripples. Julian was overcorrecting now, pulling deals last minute, rewriting contracts that didn't need rewriting, pushing Elena to attend events she no longer wanted to be seen at. Elena had changed. Her public smile remained flawless, but privately, she was unraveling. Arya learned that from a careless conversation overheard in a break room. Two assistants whispering, unaware they were being listened to. "She's asking questions now," one said, "like she's worried about being attached to him." The other snorted. "Too late." Arya wrote that down, not because it mattered emotionally, but because it mattered strategically. The next move came faster than the last. A document surfaced, old, buried, legitimate, but inconvenient. It showed Julian had personally authorized a transaction he had publicly denied knowing about. On its own, it meant nothing. Paired with the existing doubt, it was devastating. Arya didn't leak it broadly. She sent it to one person, a former colleague of Julian's, who had been quietly sidelined months earlier. The effect was immediate. Within days, whispers became conversations. Conversations became meetings. Julian wasn't invited to. By the time he realized what was happening, He was already reacting instead of leading. He tried to regain control by doing what had always worked before. He called in favors. Some answered. Most didn't. One finally said it out loud. "You're radioactive right now." Julian hung up and stared at the phone like it had betrayed him. That night, he drove past the old apartment he and Arya once shared. The lights were off, the windows dark. She was gone. That unsettled him more than anything else. Arya watched his world tighten from a distance. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't angry. She was precise. 9 months in, the regulatory review expanded, quietly, thoroughly. Julian's legal team assured him it was procedural, but their voices lacked conviction. Elena left the city for personal reasons. That was the headline. The truth was messier. She had called Arya once. Arya let it go to voicemail. The message was long, apologetic, defensive, carefully worded to avoid responsibility. Arya deleted it without listening twice. The final phase began with an invitation. Julian requested a meeting. Neutral location. No lawyers. Arya agreed. They sat across from each other in a private room of a nearly empty restaurant. Julian looked thinner, older, still composed, but strained. "You could have ended this sooner," he said after a moment. Arya met his gaze calmly. "So could you." He leaned forward. "You know this won't end the way you think." "I know exactly how it ends," she replied. "You lose control." Julian laughed softly. "You think this is about control?" She nodded once. "Everything is." He studied her, searching for the woman he'd dismissed as predictable. She wasn't there anymore. "What do you want?" he asked again. Arya stood. "Nothing from you." She left before he could respond. 2 weeks later, the board removed Julian from his position, pending further review. No press release, no scandal headline. Just absence. The kind that speaks louder than accusations. Arya returned to the courthouse one last time. Not as a defendant, but as a witness to closure. Her record was corrected quietly, officially. She walked down the same steps she'd once descended in cuffs. This time, no cameras followed her. That felt like victory. As you're still here, listening to how this unfolds, take a second to like the video if you're enjoying the story so far. It helps more than you think. Arya rebuilt slowly, intentionally. She didn't reclaim what she lost. She built something better. Julian Markham became a cautionary mention in business circles. Elena Pierce disappeared into obscurity. Arya moved forward. The first thing Arya noticed after Julian's removal wasn't relief. It was noise. Everyone suddenly had something to say. Messages arrived from people who hadn't answered her calls a year ago. Invitations appeared from firms that once treated her name like a liability. Apologies followed. Thin, careful ones that never quite admitted fault. She ignored most of them. Power, Arya had learned, revealed itself most clearly when people thought they were entitled to your forgiveness. She stayed focused on what mattered. Julian wasn't gone yet. He was weakened, but still dangerous. Men like him didn't disappear quietly unless forced into it. They retaliated. They rewrote narratives. They waited for attention to fade. So Arya stayed ahead. She accepted one consulting contract only, temporary, behind the scenes, with a firm that specialized in corporate restructuring. It gave her exactly what she needed, a front-row seat to Julian's unraveling. His remaining allies were fracturing. One blamed the other. Documents surfaced that contradicted previous statements. Julian's name was removed from email chains. His access downgraded. Slowly, methodically, The world he once controlled no longer responded to him. And still, he tried. A mutual contact reached out one afternoon, voice tight. "He's saying, you manipulated the review process?" Arya smiled faintly. "Of course he is. You should be careful." "I have been careful for a year," Arya replied, and ended the call. That night, Julian broke his silence publicly. A carefully crafted statement appeared online. Measured, wounded, indignant. He positioned himself as the victim of an internal misunderstanding. Claimed betrayal by associates he'd trusted. Arya read it once, then closed the screen. It wasn't meant for her. It was meant for the audience. And audiences, she knew, only believed what was reinforced. So she reinforced the truth. She released nothing new, just timed reminders. Documents already in circulation resurfaced through different channels. Patterns became undeniable when viewed side by side. Within days, the statement lost traction. Julian's voice grew quieter. Arya's grew stronger. She was invited to speak privately with the regulatory board, overseeing the review. Not to accuse, not to dramatize, to clarify. She arrived calm, prepared, unflinching. They asked careful questions. She answered precisely. No embellishment, no emotion. When she finished, one member leaned back and said, "You're very composed." Arya nodded. "I had time to practice." That was the moment the balance fully tipped. The board concluded its findings weeks later. No spectacle, no headlines screaming names, just consequences. Julian Markham was formally removed from all executive roles. His remaining assets placed under scrutiny. His reputation, once pristine, now permanently questioned. He tried to reach Arya one last time. This time, she answered. "I didn't think you'd pick up," he said quietly. "I wanted to hear what you'd say," she replied. A pause, then softer. "I never thought you'd do this." Arya's voice remained even. "That was your second mistake. And the first? Believing I needed you to survive." Silence followed. Then the line went dead. Arya didn't feel triumph. She felt closure. In the weeks that followed, she made deliberate choices. She declined offers that reeked of opportunism, accepted one that aligned with her values, rebuilt her professional life with intention, not urgency. People began to associate her name not with scandal, but with resilience, and viewers listening to her story felt it too. If you're still with her at this point, pause for a second and drop a comment. Would you have walked away or planned the way Arya did? She never spoke publicly about Julian, never corrected rumors unless asked directly. The truth had a way of circulating on its own. One afternoon, she passed Elena on the street. Elena looked away first. Arya didn't stop. That chapter was over. What mattered now was forward motion. By the end of the year, Arya stood in her new office, light-filled, quiet, earned. She wasn't rebuilding what was taken. She was building something better. Julian Markham became a lesson whispered in boardrooms, a warning about underestimating the wrong person. And Arya? She moved on, not because she forgot, but because she no longer needed to remember. Arya didn't announce her return to the world. She let it notice her instead. The consulting firm she'd joined quietly expanded her role. What began as a temporary engagement became something more permanent, not because she asked, but because results followed her. Projects stabilized, clients listened, decisions that once stalled moved forward under her guidance. People didn't mention Julian anymore. They mentioned outcomes. One afternoon, a junior analyst approached her desk with a hesitant smile. I just wanted to say, I read about what happened last year. I'm glad you're here. Arya nodded. So am I. She meant it. Still, she stayed cautious. Success had taught her something Julian never learned. Visibility was optional, leverage was not. She worked behind the scenes, built alliances quietly, and never again placed her future in one person's hands. The media cycle moved on, as it always did. A different scandal, a different name. Julian Markham faded into a footnote. His once familiar face no longer appeared on panels or glossy profiles. When his name surfaced, it was usually followed by a pause, an unspoken understanding that some stories weren't worth revisiting. Elena Pierce resurfaced briefly in a lifestyle column months later, framed as a woman starting over. Arya didn't read past the headline. Starting over meant different things to different people. For Arya, it meant ownership. She took her first vacation in over a year, traveling light, alone. No itinerary, no urgency. Sitting in a quiet cafe. One morning, she watched people move past her, unaware of the weight she'd carried, or the precision with which she'd set it down. That was freedom. But the story didn't end there. One evening, a message arrived from an unfamiliar sender. The subject line was simple: request for insight. Inside was a short note from a non-profit legal advocacy group. They'd followed her case closely, quietly. They wanted her perspective on internal accountability systems and how easily power could distort them. Arya hesitated. Public involvement wasn't her goal, but impact was. She agreed to a private conversation. That conversation became another, then another. Soon, Arya found herself advising on safeguards, transparency measures, and early warning systems designed to prevent exactly what Julian had done. She spoke carefully, never naming him, never dramatizing her experience. Facts were enough. Her calm authority carried more weight than outrage ever could. At home one night, she reviewed old notes, pages filled during the years she'd spent watching, waiting, planning. She didn't need them anymore. She closed the notebook for the last time and slid it into a drawer. If you've stayed with Arya this far, this is where most stories would end. But life rarely wraps itself up so neatly. A year after Julian's removal, Arya received an invitation she didn't expect. A board seat, not ceremonial, not symbolic. Real influence. She considered it carefully. Saying yes meant stepping fully back into a world she'd learned to navigate cautiously. Saying no meant turning away from an opportunity she'd earned. She said yes. The first meeting was uneventful, professional, controlled, exactly how she liked it. As she left the building afterward, her phone buzzed. A single text, no name. I didn't know you were capable of that. She stared at the screen for a long moment. Then she typed a reply. Neither did you. She deleted the thread and walked on. That night, Arya stood at her window, city lights stretching endlessly below. She thought back to the courthouse steps, the cameras, the whispers, the certainty that her life had ended. It hadn't. It had narrowed, focused, sharpened. And when it widened again, it did so on her terms. If this part of her story resonates with you, take a second to like the video. It helps stories like this reach the people who need them. Months later, Arya crossed paths with a former colleague at an industry event. He hesitated before speaking, then finally said, "You handled that better than anyone I know." Arya smiled faintly. "I handled it the only way that made sense." "Revenge?" She shook her head. Clarity. The word surprised even her, because that's what the year had given her. Not bitterness, not obsession, but understanding of herself, of power, of how easily people underestimated silence. She left the event early, stepping into the cool night air without regret. There was nothing left to prove. Julian Markham never regained his position. His attempts at reinvention were polite, muted, largely ignored. The world he once dominated had moved on without him. Arya didn't track his progress. She didn't need to. Her future was no longer shaped by his past. And that was the real revenge. If you're feeling this story so far, subscribing helps us bring you more stories like this every day. The strange thing about winning was how quiet it sounded afterward. Arya expected something louder, a sense of triumph, a clear emotional release. Instead, what followed was a steady calm that settled into her life like it had always belonged there. No sudden joy, no lingering anger, just balance. She had learned to trust that feeling. The board position placed her in rooms she once would have entered beside Julian. Now she entered alone, respected on her own terms. The conversations were different this time, less performative, more deliberate. People listened when she spoke, not because of who she was associated with, but because of what she understood. That difference mattered. One meeting ended with a senior member leaning across the table. "You see problems before they become visible," he said. "How?" Arya didn't answer immediately. Then calmly, "Because I've lived inside one." The room fell quiet. No one asked her to elaborate. They didn't need to. Outside of work, her life simplified. She kept her circle small, chose her time carefully. Trust became something earned slowly, not given freely. She didn't regret that. If anything, it felt like growth. One afternoon, as she left her office, she noticed a familiar figure across the street. Julian. Not the man she remembered, but a thinner version, posture slightly off, confidence dulled at the edges. He stood as if debating whether to cross over, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. Arya didn't stop walking. He followed. "Arya!" he called. She turned, not startled, not annoyed, just attentive. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said. "I didn't expect you to follow me," she replied evenly. Julian hesitated. "I wanted to apologize." She studied his face, not searching for sincerity, but measuring intent. "For what?" she asked. "For everything." Arya considered the word. "Everything is vague," he swallowed. "For what I did." "And what was that?" she pressed. Julian's jaw tightened. "You know." She nodded slowly. "I do." Silence stretched between them, heavy but controlled. "I lost more than I thought I would," he said quietly. Arya's voice remained calm. "So did I." He looked up, eyes searching for something. Absolution, perhaps, or acknowledgement. He found neither. "I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for," Arya said, then turned and walked away. She didn't look back. That night, she reflected on how differently the encounter had gone than she once imagined. There was no satisfaction in seeing him diminished, no sense of closure tied to his regret. Closure, she realized, had already happened. Weeks later, Arya received another invitation, this one unexpected in a different way. A media outlet wanted to profile her, not about Julian, not about scandal, about leadership. She declined. The second request came from a smaller platform, then a third. Each time, the angle was the same: resilience, decision-making, navigating power ethically. She agreed to one on her terms. The interview was brief. No names, no dramatics. When asked how she handled betrayal, Arya answered simply, "I focused on what I could control." The piece gained quiet traction. Not viral, but meaningful. People reached out. Some shared similar experiences. Others asked for advice. Arya responded selectively. One message stood out. "I'm in the middle of something I don't think I'll survive." "How did you wait so long without breaking?" Arya typed carefully. "I didn't wait. I worked." The message felt right. If you're still watching at this point, this is where the story shifts. From revenge to impact. Take a moment to comment if any part of this resonates with you. As months passed, Arya noticed something unexpected. She was no longer defined by what happened to her. She was defined by what she chose next. That realization changed everything. Her work expanded into mentorship, quiet, behind-the-scenes guidance for women navigating environments built to underestimate them. She never positioned herself as a savior. She offered perspective, tools, clarity. She knew better than anyone that strength wasn't loud. It was patient. Julian Markham's name surfaced once more, in a minor article about a failed startup attempt. Arya skimmed the headline and moved on. Some stories didn't deserve rereading. One evening, sitting alone with a glass of wine, Arya thought about the year she'd spent planning. The nights she doubted herself. The discipline it took not to react when reacting would have felt easier. She didn't romanticize it. That year had cost her something, but it had also given her something priceless. Control. Not over others, but over herself. That was the part people missed when they called it revenge. It wasn't about punishing Julian. It was about reclaiming authorship over her own life. As she turned off the lights and prepared for bed, Arya felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Arya had learned something important about endings. They rarely arrived all at once. Instead, they came in fragments, small confirmations that the past no longer had the authority it once did. A meeting that ended without tension. A decision made without hesitation. A night's sleep uninterrupted by memory. She noticed those moments now. They mattered. Her work on the board expanded quietly. She became known not for charisma, but for judgment. When disagreements arose, people turned to her, not to lead the argument, but to resolve it. She asked the questions others avoided. She slowed conversations when momentum threatened to override sense. That restraint earned her influence. One afternoon, after a long session reviewing risk assessments, a colleague pulled her aside. "You don't flinch," he said, "even when things get ugly." Arya considered the observation. "I already know what ugly looks like." Outside of work, her life found a rhythm that felt honest. Morning walks, evenings spent reading or cooking without distraction. She didn't rush to fill the quiet. She let it exist. The phone rang less often now, and when it did, the calls carried purpose. One evening, a former prosecutor reached out, not about Julian, but about process failures. "Your case changed how we handle internal referrals," she said. "You should know that." Arya closed her eyes briefly. "That matters," she replied. Because it did. Change didn't always come with credit. Sometimes it came quietly, invisibly, reshaping systems from the inside. That was enough. Still, the past had a way of resurfacing when least expected. An invitation arrived in the mail, thick paper, understated design. A gala celebrating industry leadership. Julian's former firm was listed among the sponsors. Arya hesitated, not because she was afraid, but because she understood what appearances meant. She attended anyway. The room was full of polished conversations and carefully managed smiles. Arya moved through it calmly, exchanging greetings, noting shifts. People who once avoided her now sought her out. Midway through the evening, she felt it before she saw it. Julian was there, not as a guest of honor, not even as a central figure. He lingered near the edge of the room, posture stiff, eyes scanning faces that no longer looked back. Their eyes met briefly. Julian looked away first. Arya didn't approach him. She didn't need to. The moment passed quietly, but it marked something final. Not because she'd proven anything, but because she no longer felt the need to. Later that night, as she stepped outside into cool air, her phone buzzed. A message from a number she didn't recognize. "I see what you've become." Arya stared at the words, then deleted them. What she'd become wasn't for him to define. As the year turned, Arya found herself in a position she never anticipated, one where her story inspired others without being retold. She was invited to mentor quietly, advise discreetly, intervene strategically. She chose carefully. One mentee, young and visibly overwhelmed, asked her during a late conversation, "How do you know when to act?" Arya answered without hesitation, "When silence stops protecting you." That truth resonated beyond the room. And now, as this story continues, pause for a moment. If you've made it this far, you already understand why patience can be powerful. Take a second to reflect. Would you have waited, or would you have acted sooner? The final chapters didn't unfold dramatically. Julian attempted a comeback, a rebrand, a controlled narrative. It gained little traction. The world had moved on. Arya didn't watch. She was busy building something that didn't depend on proximity to power, but on understanding it. One afternoon, she received confirmation that the non-profit she'd advised had passed new oversight protocols. Her fingerprints weren't visible anywhere, but the structure was stronger for it. That was enough. She returned home that evening and stood by the window, city lights flickering below. The same city that once watched her fall now moved without noticing her presence. She preferred it that way. The years she spent planning had taught her discipline. The years after taught her restraint. And restraint, she realized, was freedom. Not freedom from pain, but freedom from reaction. As she turned away from the window, Arya allowed herself a rare smile. Not because of what she'd taken from Julian, but because of what she'd kept. Her voice, her clarity, her future. And with that, the story edged closer to its final turn, not with noise, but with certainty. By the time winter returned, Arya realized something subtle had changed. People no longer spoke to her about what happened. They spoke to her because of who she was now. The distinction mattered. She noticed it in meetings, where her input shaped outcomes, instead of being politely acknowledged. She noticed it in quiet conversations afterward, when people asked how she thought, not what she'd endured. Her past had stopped being the headline. It had become context. That was power. The non-profit work expanded, carefully, intentionally. Arya refused anything that felt performative. She preferred small, durable systems, processes that worked even when no one was watching. That philosophy earned her trust in places she never expected. One afternoon, during a strategy session, someone asked, "How do you know when a system is broken?" Arya answered calmly, "When it protects reputation more than people." The room went still. Then pens moved. Notes were taken. She smiled to herself. That night, she walked home instead of calling a car. The city felt different when you moved through it slowly. Familiar streets no longer held echoes. Buildings that once intimidated her now felt neutral, just structures, no memories attached. She passed the courthouse without thinking. That surprised her. Later that week, an envelope appeared at her office. No return address. Inside was a single document, Julian's final settlement agreement. Not for her, for him. His last attempt to stabilize what remained of his professional life. She skimmed it once, then filed it away. The man who framed her no longer occupied her emotional space. He occupied a file. Julian reached out one final time, not directly, but through a mutual acquaintance who still believed in mediation. He wants to talk, the acquaintance said carefully. Closure, maybe. Arya considered it longer than she expected. Then she declined. Closure wasn't something someone else could give her anymore. It was something she'd already taken. As the year came to an end, Arya accepted one last invitation, this one personal. A small gathering of people she trusted. No industry talk, no strategy, just conversation. Someone raised a glass and said, "To starting over." Arya corrected gently, "To moving forward." They drank to that. Later, alone again, Arya reflected on how close she'd come to reacting instead of planning. How easily she could have burned bridges, made noise, demanded justice loudly. None of that would have worked. What worked was patience. And patience, she understood now, wasn't passive. It was deliberate restraint. If this part of her story resonates with you, stay with it. The ending isn't about spectacle. It's about meaning. The final confirmation came unexpectedly. An internal memo circulated through the board, confirming that new oversight protocols, ones Arya had quietly helped design, were now standard across multiple organizations. Her name wasn't attached. It didn't need to be. She read the memo twice. Then she closed her laptop and leaned back, breathing out slowly. The system that failed her once would not fail someone else the same way. That was enough. On a quiet evening not long after, Arya ran into someone from her past, a former colleague who'd cut ties when the scandal broke. "I wanted to say something," the woman said, awkward but sincere. "I didn't handle things well back then." Arya listened. "I was scared," the woman continued. "I didn't know what to believe." Arya nodded. "I understand." The apology wasn't necessary, but it was received. Forgiveness, Arya had learned, wasn't about erasing the past. It was about refusing to carry it forward. When she returned home, she stood by the window once more, city lights reflecting softly in the glass. The woman who'd walked out of that courthouse a year ago felt like someone she knew, but no longer inhabited. She hadn't erased that version of herself. She had outgrown her. And now, with the story nearing its end, one truth stood above all others. Revenge wasn't the year she spent planning. Revenge was the life she built after no one was watching anymore. Arya stopped thinking of the year she spent planning as something that belonged to the past. It wasn't a chapter she closed. It was a skill she carried. That awareness surfaced one morning during a board discussion when a heated disagreement broke out between two senior members. Voices rose. Positions hardened. The room tilted toward impulse. Arya didn't raise her voice. She waited. When the silence finally drew attention, she spoke calmly. "Everyone here is reacting. No one is listening. That's how mistakes happen." The room stilled. She outlined a solution neither side had considered, not because it was clever, but because it was patient. The tension dissolved. The decision passed unanimously. Later, someone remarked, "You always know when to step in." Arya thought of Julian then, not with anger, but with distance. She knew when to step in because she'd learned what happened when you didn't. Her life outside work reflected the same clarity. She no longer over-explained, no longer rushed to justify herself. People either met her where she was, or they didn't, and she was fine with that. One evening, while sorting through old files she'd never fully unpacked, she found a printed copy of the original accusation against her. The language was cold, official, final. She read it once more, not to relive it, to measure how far she'd come. Then she shredded it. The sound was small, controlled, irreversible. That night she dreamed, not of courtrooms or betrayal, but of quiet rooms filled with light, of conversations that didn't require vigilance, of trust that didn't feel like risk. She woke rested. The following weeks passed without incident. No surprise messages, no sudden reversals, just forward motion. That was how she knew it was truly over. The story others told about Julian Markham had crystallized into something simple. A man who underestimated someone he thought he controlled. Nothing more, nothing less. Arya never corrected it. She didn't need to. One afternoon, a colleague approached her after a presentation. "You never talk about what happened to you," he said thoughtfully. "Doesn't it feel unfinished?" Arya smiled faintly. "It feels complete." What made the difference? She considered the question carefully. "I stopped needing to be understood by the person who hurt me." That answer lingered between them. If you're still here, listening to this story unfold, take a moment to reflect. Would you have needed confrontation, or would you have chosen control? As the year turned again, Arya marked the anniversary privately. No ceremony, no reflection post, just a walk through the city at dusk, watching lights come on one by one. She passed familiar places without flinching. That mattered. At a quiet cafe, she sat with a notebook, not the old one filled with timelines and leverage, but a new one. This one held plans, ideas, futures. She wasn't planning revenge anymore. She was planning growth. A text arrived from someone she'd mentored months earlier. "I used your advice. I didn't react. It worked." Arya smiled and typed back. "It usually does." That was when she realized the story had outgrown her. It wasn't just about what she survived. It was about what others could learn from it. She closed the notebook and finished her coffee, feeling the kind of satisfaction that didn't demand witnesses. The world outside moved on. Headlines changed. Names rose and fell. But inside her life, the balance held. Julian Markham was no longer a shadow she stepped around. He was a lesson she no longer needed to repeat. And with that understanding, the story approached its final breath. Not with a dramatic confrontation, but with certainty. Arya had won long before anyone noticed, and that was exactly how she intended it. The last confirmation came quietly, the way most real endings did. Arya was reviewing notes late one evening when an internal update crossed her screen. Routine language, neutral tone. The regulatory review connected to Julian's case was officially closed. No further action, no pending appeals, final. She read it once, then she closed the file. That was it. No fireworks, no vindication speech, just the knowledge that nothing from that year could reach her anymore. She leaned back in her chair and let the silence settle. It felt earned. The city outside her window moved at its usual pace. Cars passed. Lights flickered on and off in distant buildings. Somewhere, people were beginning stories that would change their lives without them knowing it yet. Arya thought about the version of herself who once believed justice would arrive quickly, loudly, and publicly. The woman who assumed truth was enough on its own. She didn't judge that version of herself. She honored her, because without that belief, she never would have learned what came next. Strength wasn't volume. Power wasn't spectacle. And revenge, real revenge, was never about destruction. It was about authorship. She closed her laptop and stood, stretching slowly, deliberately. Tomorrow's schedule was full. Meetings, decisions, forward motion. A life that no longer revolved around reaction. That was the victory. Weeks later, Arya received a handwritten note, unusual enough that she paused before opening it. The paper was thick, the handwriting careful. "I don't know if you'll remember me," it began. "I was the assistant who avoided you when everything happened. I just wanted you to know. Watching how you handled it changed how I handle things now." Arya read the note twice. She folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer she reserved for reminders, not of pain, but of impact. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Impact didn't require acknowledgement to exist. The final time Julian Markham's name crossed her path was almost anticlimactic. A brief mention in a conversation about risk management. A cautionary example, nothing more. No one lingered on it. Neither did she. That night, Arya met a friend for dinner. Someone new, someone who knew her only as she was now. They talked about work, travel, plans. Not once did the past enter the conversation. And that was when it hit her. She had crossed the threshold. The story no longer followed her. She followed herself. As she walked home afterward, coat pulled tight against the cool air, Arya passed the courthouse one last time. Not out of intention, but coincidence. The steps were empty, quiet. She didn't stop. She didn't look back. She kept walking. If you've stayed with this story to the very end, you already understand what made it different. This wasn't about a woman who waited helplessly for justice. It was about a woman who chose timing over noise, strategy over reaction, control over chaos. And that choice changed everything. Arya reached her building and paused, glancing up at the darkened windows above. Somewhere inside, her life waited. Calm, intentional, hers. Before going in, she took a breath and allowed herself one final thought. Not about Julian, not about betrayal, not even about revenge. About the quiet satisfaction of knowing she never became the person who hurt her. She became something better. And that, more than anything else, was the ending. If this story resonated with you, if it held your attention, if it reminded you that patience and clarity can be powerful, take a moment now. Like the video. Share your thoughts in the comments. And subscribe for more stories like this. Because there are always more stories worth telling. And sometimes the strongest ones are the quietest. Thank you for watching. Until the next story, stay strong, stay hopeful, stay inspired.